I'm Caroline Sinders. I'm one of the invited speakers, so I guess it's kind of like a keynote. And I am an online harassment researcher who spent the past 5 years studying digital protest and online harassment. I currently work at the Wikimedia Foundation, and I have a fellowship with BuzzFeed and Eyebeam to explore if machine learning can mitigate online harassment, and how do we think about harassment as this emotional or violent data. What does it mean to have it sort of established now as this data we can interact with, but that's harmful to look at? Well, I think a lot of my interest in social networks has been because I started off as a photojournalist, and I was interested in how photography was being changed by technology as I was going through photo school. But I was also studying different subcultures that existed inside of blogging networks. So I got really into people that were fashion bloggers, and I was a street style photographer at the time, and I was also assisting a New York Times photographer, and I was shooting a lot for different magazines. And so I started studying people that were using blogging platforms to disrupt the fashion industry. And I realized that they could only do that because of technology, and they could also only do it at this right time, that the big fashion bloggers had just been the early fashion bloggers. They weren't necessarily better fashion bloggers, they were just more well known because the platform had been really small. I think someone like Neil Dash is a good example too. Like, he started off on Twitter really early. He was friends with people that made Twitter. He was then a recommended user to follow when you signed up for Twitter. I think Anil is great and is a fantastic tweeter, and he's also a friend of mine. But also, like, he was an early adopter of the platform, and thus he became well known inside of the platform. So I was really interested in how people were misusing technology in a new and different way. I then decided to get a master's in technology, and I trained to be a UX designer. And also photography it's a technical art, so I think it's really related to UX design. I'm still technically a UX designer, but UX design and design research go hand in hand. So I then went and worked at IBM Watson, and I was already interested in language and protest because I'd been studying social networks and subcultures. And then at my master's, I switched from focusing on like fandoms, and I focused more on protests, and I was studying with Clay Shirky, who's written this book called Here Comes Everybody. It's all about how technology is changing the way we collaborate and like how we exist inside the commons. And so it made sense to focus on language. And then I got a job at IBM Watson because I was really interested in what is digital language, what is language inside of technology. Language inside of technology is not defined really, because we're using systems that don't understand language to try to analyze and understand language. So I'd say, like, before like the advent of machine learning, you know, researchers would study the rise of something, or we were looking at like popularity of like analytics. So like people found out about the Arab Spring because they were seeing like tweet storms, and they were seeing like popular tweets happening. But then also like some like journalists were like using this as a way to see what was happening in the world without having to be in that part of the world. And then it got reported about in real time. And I think we see that a lot with any kind of like attack that happens or any kind of election. It was easy to follow the French election in real time on Twitter. It was easy to follow the American election in real time because of Twitter. So we're like consuming information and publishing information at such a fast pace that like any analytic system could like sort of serve up and say, well, this is what this geolocation is talking about. Now what's different is we're not sort of going based off just that. We're also going based off like analytic algorithms that are creating patterns, but we don't know what the patterns are. And from there are companies that are creating things that are like trying to create systems of like, is this more interesting? So like you can use algorithms to surface up more interesting content, but we don't know what more interesting is. So it's actually hard to have like whimsy inside of that. Like, how do you define whimsy inside of code? That's really hard. And so we have these like more classic algorithmic language structures that do like sentiment analysis, where there's like 4 or 5 sentiments, right? It's like, I'm gonna remember, it's anger, disgust, joy, fear, and sadness. And I guess I forgot joy. But like, how, like whimsy, is that joy? It's a subset of joy, but how do you define like whimsy? And if you run any kind of like language, like any kind of paragraph through this language analysis, you'll see where it's like not totally accurate. And it's also really hard with context. And so I think that's the hard part we're in, where we don't have, one, I don't think we should be using technology to analyze everything we're saying, which sounds probably controversial given what my work is. But two, like, they're also not very nuanced. So do we create more nuance, or do we just not bother? There aren't a lot of data sets that are large in the world. Like, a lot of social networks have data sets, right? Like Google has data sets, for example, like Google Images, like any image that like you can search. What is hard is like training computer vision, for example, to recognize what's in those data sets. And some data sets need to be biased. Like, if you are training a computer vision algorithm on how to recognize white middle schoolers, for example, you would need to know that that's the white middle schoolers data set, right? But the problem is when you take data sets when you don't know how biased they are, meaning like, oh, this data set has 3,000 images, 1,500 of them are white males of the same age. Okay, that means that that's like half the data set. If that's half the data set and there's nothing else like counterweighting it equally, it's already trained more to recognize stereotypically male faces and stereotypically male white faces. So that's a way that it's already biased. So it's more thinking about what is inside of the data you're using. So if someone's like, oh, well, we scraped Twitter to teach this chatbot how to talk like a, like casually. Well, you took one platform where people have short conversations, so really short conversations, and you're using that alone as your model for what is a more witty conversation. Well, that's not actual like wit, or it's not more chatty, it's just short, and it happens to be on a publicly accessible space, right? So like, can a conversation be just construed to 140 characters? Like, no. Really funny things can take a really long time to say. Really mean things can take a really long time to say. Some really bland things can take just one sentence or like one word, right? So it's thinking about like, if you want to do X, really how do you build out X? Like, if you want to make something like a chatbot, for example, that is saying that's what she said jokes, really what do you need for that? You need a lot of that's what she said jokes. So then you need a data set of that's what she said jokes. So if I'm trying to build an algorithm to understand irony, I shouldn't build it just off that's what she said jokes. I need other things. I would need Shakespeare. There's a lot of dramatic irony in Shakespeare. But if I build my irony bot just based off Shakespeare and that's what she said jokes, what does that sound like then in a conversation, right? It's a really old text and a really new text, so then like linguistically it doesn't sound right either. So you need all this other stuff to build one thing, right? To build an idea. And I think it's not knowing what's inside of the data sets, like that's what makes it problematic. It's not that they're inherently biased in a malicious way, they just are inherently biased because data sets are often really specific. So I spent the past 6 months studying the alt-right, specifically inside the United States, though there are some European aspects to the data set because there are European members of Reddit and 4chan and 8chan. Though it is a very American-centric site because a lot of the conversations are specifically around American politics. That being said, like a lot of the words that are being used, they're slang terms that are official inside of this community because they also exist inside of guides that the community publishes. So I'm taking what is effectively peer-reviewed alt-right terms, so like normalized racist terms that are then, again, reshared inside of their community, and that's sort of what I'm using as the basis of this hate speech database. The thing about it is, like, if you were to scrape Reddit and see if you could autonomously find those words, you couldn't. You could go based off popularity, and I think what I showed online, maybe what I showed in the talk, and what I should probably say like in another talk going forward is like, the most hateful words I found don't appear on there because they're not the most popular words. That doesn't make them any less hateful, and that doesn't make them any less important to the community, right? Like, if I'm on a subreddit talking about makeup, you maybe don't know that I love pie because I'm not in the pie subreddit. Or if we're in a subreddit again on makeup and we're talking about eyeliner and lipstick, we don't talk a lot about blush. That doesn't make blush any less important to the community. It doesn't make blush any less of an entity of makeup. It's just not what we're talking about right then, right? And I think a bigger thing to think about is a lot of the terms they use are terms that are supposed to be used negatively, so they wouldn't use them to each other. They wouldn't say, you're this thing. They wouldn't say this other thing. But they're terms that when they do get referenced, they don't get explained because you're already supposed to know them. So I think that's the big thing. It's like you can't autonomously search for that. You have to have an ethnographer go through and look at that. And that's really the bigger thing, is understanding it's not about volume, it's about the importance it holds in the community. And that importance often isn't discussed right in the moment, like, let's talk about this person. Oh, this person seems important. Yeah, he is important. Like, you can't run an algorithm looking for like name plus importance. Like, you just have to know who they are, and that's why they publish these guides. So it's like, if these guides are the things that are like, this is the important stuff to know in the community, you should go based off those guides. My story is really long, I guess. Yeah, I just really like machine learning. I started working with it at IBM Watson, and I think it's going to radically change product design, and I think it's going to radically change the way we talk to each other online. I think it's already starting to do that, and I think it's a space that users need transparency around. If it's already inside of these massive communication spaces that we exist in, users deserve to have agency around those algorithms. They deserve to know what's being done and why it's being parsed, and they deserve to have spaces to intervene, spaces to say, no, I don't want this content served up to me. I don't want this saved. I don't want this offered to me. There should be a way to algorithmically allow users to algorithmically fight.